Hello, everybody. My name is Andrea Coombe. I have the great privilege of being the Chief Executive of the Howard League for Penal Reform. Thank you for joining us today for this Spotlights event on an incredibly critical issue for, I think, the prison system, certainly for the Howard League. It's one of our priorities, but also, I think, for the credibility of the criminal justice system and frankly, the fabric of the rule of law in this country. Which is the ongoing crisis of the IPP sentence. And I'll introduce our panel in a second. Just a couple of housekeeping matters. I'm going to speak to the panel for about half an hour. There'll be the opportunity for you to ask questions. I'd encourage you to get your questions in early. Please put them into the Q&A box and use the chat box to share links, tell us, give feedback, all of that other stuff. But if you have any questions, please do put them into the Q&A box rather than putting them into the chat. Please also note that we're recording this event. That's so it can be available to those people who weren't able to join us in person today, and it will be put up onto our YouTube channel. And finally, we're going to be talking about things I think that sometimes are going to be upsetting. So I just wanted to flag that for people in the audience. That a lot of the content, because of the nature of this sentence, is going to be perhaps quite troubling. As I mentioned, one of our priorities as an organisation is the IPP sentence. When I first joined the Howard League, we asked our members what we should be working on. I have to say, more than anything else, the feedback was that we should be working on IPPs every day in a job which is not very constant. The one constant is that pretty much every day I receive at least one, often more, letters from people serving an IPP sentence, explaining the stress that they're under, expressing concern about the future, asking questions about what's happening, and I have to say also expressing thanks, perhaps more than any other group of people in prison, for our ongoing work. But for those of you who are unfamiliar, the IPP sentence was brought in by New Labour. It took effect in April 2005 and was intended for serious offences that didn't merit a life sentence. It was actually used for many different, far less serious offences that we'll perhaps get onto. But people on an IPP sentence were to serve a minimum tariff and then had to basically stay in prison until the parole board found them fit for release. And then after they were released, they were on licence. They are on licence for 10 years and can be recalled at any time. The sentence was abolished 11 and a half years ago, but to this day we have 2,796 people still in prison serving an IPP. So about 60% of them, 59%, have been recalled. So they've been released and then recalled. But there are 1,180 odd people who have never been released. Only 13 people of this nearly 3,000 people, only 13 of them are still serving their minimum tariff. Everybody else is over tariff. And there are many people who are decade more over tariff. So the impact of this sentence we'll be talking about today, and all of the other challenges, the mental health challenges, the challenges of recall and release. And we have, I'm thrilled to say, a really expert panel with deep personal experience. So we have Donna Mooney, who is a part of UNGRIP, which is a leading IPP charity, and also Andrew Morris, who is also involved with UNGRIP and has personal experience, as Donna does, of the IPP sentence. And I'm delighted to make the first public announcement that Andrew Morris is one of 5 new trustees who was appointed on Tuesday to be a trustee of the Howard League. So this is Andy's first outing with his new hat on. I think we got all the panels on the screen. So I'm really thank you both so much for joining us in this week, which I think HMPPS has declared IPP Week. So it's a week to draw attention to this sentence. And perhaps members of our audience would have seen yesterday's article in The Guardian about the IPP sentence, focused actually on Donna and her brother. But Donna, do you want to talk to us a little bit about how you got involved in all of this?
Hi, I'm Donna Mooney. Yes, thanks, Andrea. So I don't know how many people read the article yesterday, but I'll give you a quick lowdown if you didn't. So my brother Tommy was serving an IPP with a 4-year tariff. He was over tariff and had had a second knockback, and he'd had quite a severe deterioration in his mental health. Support was appalling, as is often the case, and he took his own life. That was almost 9 years ago. And so kind of prior to that, I didn't really know what the IPP was. I didn't really understand it. Tommy had talked about it. I just was a bit in disbelief that England would ever do something like that. But clearly they did, and they still do. And so, the more I found out about it, the angrier I got. The more I found out about what had happened to my brother, the angrier I got. And I just kind of wanted to do something to raise the profile of what had happened to Tommy, but also to try and put a stop to it happening. And, the depressing nature of someone who you love having died, I mean, it wrecks your life, really. But the silver lining is that no one can hurt them anymore. So I could say what I wanted and do what I wanted, and it wouldn't impact him. So I kind of used that, I don't know, that anger and frustration, and just kind of started, connecting with people, looking into things about the IPP, about the suicides, and kind of things developed from there. I met a lot of family members who've been campaigning for a long time, and kind of joined bands with them, and we set up various things. So one of the things that kind of was set up initially was the Forgotten, which was basically a platform for people to share their stories around IPP, because one of the things that I was very aware of is people were really scared about being open and honest about what happened to them, because they were worried about repercussions, even if they were in the community or in prison. I didn't have that because Tommy was no longer alive, so it couldn't affect him. Whereas other people were afraid to talk. So we set up a platform that was anonymous where people could share that information. And that, that was kind of the beginnings, really. And then that kind of progressed onto UNGRIP. UNGRIP was initially set up as a platform for information sharing and collective action. But it's kind of progressed into something much, much bigger, and is now quite a big platform for campaigning against the IPP. Our goals have always been resentencing should be the thing that happens. But we're also realistic that if that doesn't happen, then what else needs to happen beneath that? I mean, that will always be an overarching goal. So, the campaigning kind of is a huge part of UNGRIP, and we do that in many different forms, but the other part of UNGRIP is also support because of, our connection with people directly affected by the sentence, which is at the heart of everything that we do. We try and make sure we keep the voices of people directly affected. I'm directly affected, other people who are directly involved in UNGRIP are, but we also try and make sure that the voices of those on the wider, are involved in that. But because of that, we've got a lot of connections with people directly affected by it. And so, we kind of started beginning to support people in different ways. And that's kind of grown year on year. We're now supporting over 300 people in prison on an IPP, and many families and people on IPP in the community. And that takes different forms. It goes from, it might go from just day-to-day letter writing to, connecting them to support and organisations that might help them in various ways. So, UNGRIP has kind of grown hugely over the last 3 years. We've only been around as it stands in the last 3 years, and the work we do is growing. We try and make sure, like I said, anything we do is got the heart of people directly affected by it, and anything that we do, we try and make sure they're involved in those decisions. And we're very mindful of that, and the impact that things can have on people. So, that's kind of UNGRIP in a nutshell. I mean, you can go and find out a bit more on our website if you wanted to, and that's my into this is my brother. That's me.
And Andy, your in is yourself.
Yes, myself. I served a total of 12 and a half years on IPP. So the first 6 years, I kind of got through as best I could, and fought with really sadly suicidal ideation. You know, Donna referred to it a little bit in the beginning. I didn't have anyone to talk to. You know, I really struggled with that because it took me about 3 years to get my head around the ramifications of the sentencing. Because I remember hearing the judge when he was sentencing me say the words discretionary, indeterminate, and life, and all these words are racing past my face because I'm thinking, is this guy really talking about me? And then when I left court, I spoke to my legal representative, and they couldn't really explain, in a succinct way that I could get my head around what the next steps were.
You think they really understood it at the
I don't
time?
think they did. No, I don't think they did. I certainly know that prison officers, prison probation staff, and even external probation staff had no clue because they kept referring me on to other people. So it was a never-ending, spiral of going here, there, and everywhere. And to be honest, the most of the information that I found was from a prison newspaper called The Inside Time. And I was always reluctant at times to take in. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's a fantastic medium. Sometimes I'd read stuff and I think, right, any minute now I'm going home because I'd hear stuff about changes that were coming in. And the earliest change I heard when I got my IPP in 2007, I heard that there was a change coming in 2008 when the immigration and something or other bill was passed. But unfortunately, it didn't apply to me. And it didn't apply to anybody who was, by this time already in custody waiting to do offending behaviour courses in various parts of the country. I was asked to do, well, no, I wasn't asked. I was told that I was going to do a particular piece of work and that there was a huge waiting list. And that I met a guy along the way who put it really plainly for me. When I met this guy in Devon, in a prison in Devon, I asked him what his tariff was. His tariff was 12 months, but he put it into context when he said, but the waiting list for the course that I have to do is 5 years. So I'm going to do at least 5 years before I get onto that course and then convince people that I'm safe enough to be released. And that was my experience also. I waited about 3.5, 4 years, I think, before I did the offending behaviour course to convince the parole board that I was safe enough
What was
to...
your original tariff?
Sorry, say that again?
Your original tariff?
My original tariff was 1 year, 254 days. And I met people with worse than that. That's why sometimes I'd look at it and I think, well, maybe it's not so bad. But then I met the worst one. I met a guy who'd been in for 3 years when I met him, and his tariff was 28 days. And his case formed some case law. We became really good friends, but that really put it into context for me. It was really one of the things I spent a lot of time doing is one of two things, reading or watching movies, because I would escape my reality by watching movies. And I don't know if people remember, and it may sound a bit silly, but this is how it kind of was in my head. In Superman, there's a bit in there with General Zod, and Superman casts this plastic thing around General Zod and his mates, and he throws them into space. That's how it felt for me. I felt like I was just drifting in a space of nothingness with no kind of end in sight. And at one point, I just started to really not care anymore.
Yeah. Sorry, somebody just said something about talking like Andrew. Yeah. I mean, it is that sense of being suspended in a hopeless, endless space, isn't it, Donna? I mean, that's the kind of feedback you consistently get, is people not having any sense of there being an end in sight.
There's no
We often have people write to us saying, like, the Howard League should stop doing what it's doing on IPPs and should just argue for the death penalty to come back because we'd all be better off with the death penalty, which is not at all anything we would obviously ever do. But I get that sense of, like, just give me some certainty, give me a whole life term, like, just stop the uncertainty of it all.
Yeah, I mean, we hear the same. I mean, it's this the not knowing and not having the control either. People say, well, if you just need that bit of rehabilitation, then you access it, and that's all well and good if you have control over those things. When you don't, and you have no control over even getting close to it, but then you're told that that's what you need in order to be released. Of course, it's going to damage somebody's mental health. I mean, it's understandable that will happen.
I mean, one of the things I struggled with, I read somewhere, comparison is the thief of joy. And one of the things that I did a lot on IPP is I compared, and I found it so difficult, but it was really difficult not to compare, because one of the things that happened, not to, well, actually, I'm going to be a bit subjective here. Um, I went on a behaviour course, and as a result of the work that I did on it, I was asked to be a mentor to other people going through that course. But then the staff who took me through didn't recommend release. They recommended open conditions, but they recommended release for people that I'd mentored, which didn't make any sense to me. And there were a lot of those kind of real anomalies that it was difficult to get your head around. And then if you tried to, not even in a, a kind of a mutinous type of way, but if you kind of got together with people to share stories, which I did, and try to go to the system, in the prison system, the governance, to say, look, hang on a minute, what's happening here? You then find that you're fought down by staff who think that, well, I don't know what they think, but now finally, I'm really glad that people are beginning to understand, a bit more. And as a result of the work of Howard League and UNGRIP and lots of people I've seen in this space, people are finally realizing that this thing exists and that it's wrong.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned, Andy, having to do courses. Donna and I both sit on the IPP External Challenge group, which is for HMPPS. She smiles because it's an interesting group. But we do spend a fair bit of time talking about courses. And certainly when I talk to people on IPPs, they'll often be told, for example, that, they've gone to the parole board for the third time, and now the parole board's telling them they need to do X course, which has actually been available in their jail for the last however long. And it's like they feel like there's a new hoop to jump through. I mean, was that what it felt like, Andrew? Like that? Were these courses actually helpful? Like, did you feel like they were supporting you or the people around you, or were they just another kind of obstacle to release?
100% just another obstacle. I mean, so I had to do a course. I don't hide it. It was called Healthy Relationships, and I think that got thrown out to quite a number of people. But while I was sitting down waiting for that, because they would only do 8 to 10 people per course, and in some prisons they'd only run 2, if you were lucky, 3 courses a year. But then while I was waiting, they said, "Oh, while you're at it, you might as well do enhanced thinking skills." And if you argue with that, then it's a sense of, well, you're bucking the system. You're not doing as you're told. So you do it, and then it was really funny because enhanced thinking skills then was completely rebranded. They took the enhanced off, and it just became thinking skills, which probably cost a few quid. The frustration was just not feeling that I could be myself. I couldn't be myself. Even now, I talk to lots of people who are still inside, some of them, that write to me, some that are outside. And one of them recently said something to me that really sent a shiver down my spine. He said to me, "Guess what I've got?" And I was sharing this the other day with the parole board. I said, "What?" He said, "I've got a new flat, but what's in it?" And I said, "I don't know, tell me what's in it." He said, "Absolutely nothing, because I'm scared about recall." And I just find that heartbreaking. I really do.
Yeah, I mean, we hear people going to probation with clothes, bag of clothes every time they go because they don't know whether they're going to be recalled or not. I mean, to live with that level of stress every day.
Donna, do you want to explain a little bit about how recall works and the recall stats?
So on an IPP, when you're released, you are given a set of sorry, my phone's about to start ringing, just try and quieten it. Expectations you're meant to sit within, and that will vary depending on person to person. And if your probation officer feels that those have been broken in some way, or there's a threat to them being broken, they can recall you, and that can take many different forms. An example might be that you go to a probation appointment one day, and you're told at that point that you're being recalled, and you'll sometimes have the police waiting outside, and they'll take you to the local station or the prison, and then that's it. That's how recall works. And I think when you look at the stats, I haven't seen the ones that have just been released, but generally, I think 70% of recalls are for non-compliance. And that can be anything from missing an appointment, your probation officer not knowing where you are. We've had people who've been in hospital have been recalled because their probation officer can't get a hold of them, despite them being in hospital, not having their phone with them, to various other things. The actual rate of reoffending is extremely low. And so when you think about the fact that there's 1,600 people in prison on recall, 70% haven't committed a further crime, and they're back in prison on recall indefinitely. There's no end term to that. They have to go back into this whole process of parole hearings to then be released again. It's appalling. There is a 28-day mechanism from recall where that should be reviewed, but I don't know anybody on an IPP who's ever been at that point, because it's just I've never heard of it. And when you speak to people at the parole board, they say that it's because information hasn't been detailed enough or sent into them that's clear enough to explain what the recall was about. So and who knows what the real reason is? That might be a blame here or there, or someone not doing the job properly, who knows. But 70% of recalls on non-compliance is appalling for an indefinite period on people who've already served their tariff many years over. It just perpetuates that damage. And I think, as a loved one, also the damage that causes, we speak to families all the time who have said, their loved one just disappeared. And then they heard, I don't know, a few days later that they've been recalled. We speak to people all the time that, have been recalled and they lose everything. There's a chap we're in contact with now where we're trying to help him save property in his flat because he's been recalled, and it's just going to get sent to the tip. His whole life's been turned upside down. So it's horrendous that this is continuing to happen to people because it's so unnecessary. And I know this is going a bit off topic, but I've seen this question popped up a few times, and I've seen it myself actually on social media. So Sam's asked if there's been an informal agreement between stakeholders and the Ministry of Justice that resentencing is taken off the table. Absolutely not. Resentencing is always at the top of our agenda as UNGRIP, and I know Howard League would say the same thing. However, the stakeholders can't change the law. So when we go to those meetings with the stakeholders and HMPPS is to challenge them with what they're doing on the day-to-day staff. It doesn't mean that we don't have resentencing on the table. That conversation happens with ministers who can change the law, and those are the people that we push for it. It doesn't mean that we don't flag that to the HMPPS in those stakeholder meetings, because we do, and they know our feelings on that. They were very clear on that, but they can't change the law. So, we push them in ways that they're overseeing to try and flag actually what they're doing isn't working, that reinforces the point that resentencing is the only way to fix this. So I just wanted to kind of make sure we covered that, because I've seen that question floating around a lot, and I just want to make sure that everyone's really clear on that. We're not getting into bed with HMPPS by going to these meetings. We're going there to try and...
Oh, not at all. It is for any, it's definitely not. It's a very challenging meeting. It is not a cozy meeting, I think is fair to say. And it's right that, we be there to challenge HMPPS around things like the action plan and other things we'll talk about. Andy, any thoughts on recall? You'd experienced recall from my recollection.
Yeah, recall was really frustrating. Of course it would be. I did longer on recall than I did for the original part of my custodial sentence. So I did 6 years, got out very briefly, and then got recalled for 6.5 years. And, I kind of went in and out of open prisons, which I found really difficult because, it's never easy. But the thing is, all IPPs are kept in on the basis that they're a danger to the public, supposedly. And yet, while I was on my recall, I worked for, a well-known charity giving advice to members of the public. So I'm just in my head thinking, how can I be a danger to these members of the public if I'm in their space and giving them advice every day? It just doesn't make sense. There were so many examples of that. But the thing that really frustrates me about recall is that when I was recalled, I spoke to my probation officer who'd had a good relationship with me up until that point. She pressed the panic button because she wasn't clear about what had taken place. And I'll be honest, I resented her at the time for it. And I did express that to her because I told her what exactly had taken place. And very long story short, I called the police to an incident and found myself being arrested, and then got taken back straight to prison. No courts, no nothing, just straight to prison, and then dumped there before I had a parole hearing. And then the parole board, I think at that time, were a little bit hesitant about re-release, although I'd explained the circumstances of what had taken place. And then I got stuck in the system. I got stuck in the system. I got to a point where um, uh, I got sent to open prison and my hand hovered over that button that everyone would have heard of, but I won't use the profanity to describe it because I just couldn't be bothered to explain myself anymore. I was done to death of explaining and being on. I never had any proven adjudications throughout my time, and people used to say to me, perhaps you need some. Because if you have a few adjudications, and for people that don't know what that is, it's basically a mini court in a prison that deals with bad behaviour. If I'd have had a few adjudications and broken some rules, people feel that perhaps I would have evened out and maybe got re-released. But I'm just not that guy. I'm not here pretending that prison probably was inevitable. It was for the offence, but I just think that it was a little bit too strong, and I think that IPP is completely and utterly wrong, particularly for people who are still in at the moment. I can see some of the comments in the chat about somebody who's been in for 18 years. I mean, it's unjustifiable. It's unforgivable.
We have one member who got a 1-year IPP and is now into his 19th year post-tariff. So he's a teenager at the time. It's just extraordinary. Can I ask you, Andy, like how much? I mean, you mentioned that you heard that there was a law coming in that was going to change things for you. I mean, I think this is something that Donna and I talk about, not like from time to time, is like how information is shared with people, political developments, possibilities, like how much of that are you informed about, consulted on, and how helpful is it? Because sometimes I feel like we raise expectations by that are then kind of damned down because things don't then materialize. But I don't know.
Prisoners are really good at sharing information. I mean, I spent a number of years watching PMQs in prison and all kinds of stuff because I could access that. What I couldn't access is obviously the internet and that kind of thing. But we would get, in our little groups, we would get family friends to look at bits and pieces and to send it in, and we'd cascade that information to one another. Prisons are really good at that. You see, one of the things that people don't see about prison is just how well prisoners can work together. All people hear about is Xboxes, violence, and the kind of offences. We're all murderers and rapists in some people's eyes. But actually, I saw guys, I was one of them, that took part in I didn't take part too much, but 24-hour kind of marathon gym session. We weren't in there for 24 hours, but we spent those hours that we could to raise money for a kid who nearly lost their life outside the prison. And when that information was cascaded because she'd been airlifted to hospital because she'd been in a road traffic accident, just to give it context. We decided to raise some money and donate some of that to Air Ambulance as well as to the kid to buy her some of the things that she wanted for that Christmas that was coming up. People don't see that stuff, all they hear about is the really horrible stuff that everybody must be, an absolute monster, and it's not the truth.
It's not. The vast majority of people in prison are just not. I mean, I was in prison recently with quite a famous actor, and he just walked around afterwards. He said, "We're just such normal people." It's like, yeah. Normal people. But you don't, as you say, you have a distorted view. Everyone's a mass murderer or a sadist or something, desperately unpleasant, as opposed to people who just don't take some bad decisions or have bad circumstances.
What I would say, though, if I may just briefly, is that while, it wasn't convenient, I'm not happy that I got recalled. In a way, it was a silver lining. Because one of the things that I was able to do is I was in an open prison very briefly, and this guy came in to talk about opportunities in the civil service that were only open to X, Y, and Z people. And I went up to him and I said to him, mate, you can't come into this space and tell me what I could have won. Tell me what the opportunities are for people like me. I got some support and I managed to leave prison and go into a job in the civil service, which I left last year, but I spent nearly 4 years in the civil service. I think it was kind of an accident on their part because there was a realization that I wasn't going to clear vetting to move on to other roles within the civil service, which is one of the reasons I left. But having said that, I don't think I'd have had that opportunity had I not been in that place at that time.
Yeah. I mean, and Donna as well, I always as well sort of see really great groups of people getting together. I mean, I'm going to a prison next week to visit some of our our Life for an IPP members, that they've come together and they're really good at supporting each other and sharing information, and they want to talk about how to reimagine the IPP sentence and life in prison and various other things. But because there are lots of great people who are lost to us because they're on this terrible sentence. Donna, maybe we should talk a bit, because they've come up in the chat a little, about the political developments. I mean, when I started this job 2.5 years ago, IPPs were obviously a thing, but it felt like it was sort of a little bit hopeless. Whereas it feels, I mean, it still feels a little bit hopeless, but it feels a lot better than it did. So maybe you could talk us through some of those developments.
I think the same, like when Tommy first died, I mean, that was 9 years ago almost. And I think if you walked into a room and said to somebody that people on IPP should be resentenced, they would think you were crazy. And that is actually the response that we'd often get. And then you fast forward, I mean, it's still not a long time, but to now, that's no longer a fringe option. We know it's not happening now, although it should. And as I said earlier, it was always going to be the thing that we push for, because it's the thing that should happen. But that, I mean, it's for that to no longer be a fringe option, and for a cross-party group of MPs to be saying this is what should happen, that is a massive step forward. And I think, in the current state, we have to hold on to the fact that we've still got that report and we can still use it, and there's more people agreeing with it now than ever before.
So this is the Justice Committee, Bob Neal's Justice Committee's report from year before last.
Yeah, I think it was 2022, wasn't it? Yeah. And their main recommendation was for resentencing. They had other recommendations within that, but that was the main recommendation. Obviously following that, Dominic Raab was in power as Secretary of State, and there was absolutely zero movement with him. In fact, he referred to the sentence as unsettling, which I find insulting. One, from a loved one who's lost someone on this sentence, but two, hearing daily the damage it's doing to people and seeing that. So at that point, I was just like, I don't even know where we go from here, because, they're not going to do anything. Obviously, he's changed and Alex Chalk has come in. And while we're not anywhere near where we would want to be, it's closer to anything than we've ever been in the last 12 years. And they're a lot closer to anything than when Dominic Raab was in position. So there's currently a bill going through Parliament called the Victims and Prisoners Bill, which I'm sure many of you may or may not be aware of. And Alex Chalk himself has put in some amendments relating to the IPP licence. I'll explain those a bit, and then I'll talk to you about the other amendments that are currently being explored. So those amendments are in. They've not been made law. They will not be made law until this bill is agreed by the Lords and the Commons and then given royal assent, which is probably not going to happen before the summer. Hopefully it happens, but there's no guarantees with this, with it. So the amendments that are currently in that Alex Chalk has put in around the licence, and I've seen some questions around that. He's putting forward that the licence that currently stands at 10 years when you can apply to have it lifted will be taken down to 3 years from first release. So anyone who's been had a release, their first release 3 years or more before, would have a referral to the parole board to have their licence looked at. He's suggesting in that following that, if the parole board say no, then the person has to spend 2 years in the community without recall, and it will automatically come off. There'll be no application. And so that would work retrospectively. So anyone who's already met that criteria, it would come off automatically. I think they're suggesting that it will reach about 1,800 people will come off of it automatically if that happens, if it goes through. As it currently stands, if that goes through as it is, if you are recalled in that time, in those 2 year period, where with the sunset clauses, which what they're referring to, that 2 year period where it comes off straight automatically, that 2 year starts again. However, there are some more other amendments that are going through Parliament at the moment. The Lords are trying to push through some other amendments. Again, they're not guaranteed. They're not in the bill yet. I think they're due to debate them in May to see which ones will be going into the Victims and Prisoners Bill. And they'll see. And do you want me to go through them in all of them, or just give a general outline?
I don't think so. I think just general.
Okay, I won't remember them all. The general outline is resentencing has been taken off. They said it's not going to go through. Even if they put it in, it will be taken out in the Commons. And what they don't want is for the bill to go to the Commons to then be ping-pong back to the Lords, because if an election happens, the bill gets pulled. They want it to go through as quickly as possible. So they're trying to be realistic as to what will be kept in there and what is most likely to be pushed through, voted on in the Commons. So there's a lot of behind the scenes conversations with the Lords and MPs around those. So things that they're looking at within that, linked to the licence, they're looking at having a clause where if you're recalled unfairly, the 2 years doesn't start again, which, I mean, that makes complete sense if it goes through. There's other ones around, some people have mentioned mentors, there's an action plan that HMPPS have put together around the IPP, dealing with the IPP issue. Just as a reinforcement, we do not believe in that action plan. We think it's a pile of rubbish, quite frankly, and we call it what it is to the people who are sharing it with us when we go to those meetings. But one of the amendments is to put that on the statute book so that it would be a legal requirement for them to have it and make sure it's implemented properly. I guess the thinking behind that is that they can be held accountable if it's not being impacted properly. Another amendment, which I think may not go through, but is currently in there, is around the sunset clause, the release test being reversed. So rather than you having to prove, if you're on an IPP, that you're no longer a threat, it's up to the state to prove that you are, based on something you've done or you're doing while in prison. So I suspect that will get a lot of pushback, even though it's quite a minor change. So kind of those are the more kind of general stuff. You know, I think a lot of the amendments that the Lords are now putting forward are things that are going to try and help, but they won't fix it. Like,
there's a government amendment yesterday. There are three of them, but one of them was that if you get recalled without further charges, it can be terminated by the Secretary of State. So no waiting for the parole board, which would be, I think, really significant. But obviously all of these things that Donna's describing, they're definitely better than nothing, but they're a core of people, particularly people who've never been released, who they're not really helping at all in the immediate future. So while we, I think, welcome a lot of this stuff, we don't think it's anywhere near adequate, I think is fair to say.
And I think 100%. I mean, that's the thing, you know, we always, you know, we push that resentencing is the only way to fix this. Great, do all those other things if you want to, but that's the one thing that will fix it. But I think the other thing is, and I don't know, maybe when you've been campaigning for a long time, you get to this point, you're like, there was no change in 12 years. There has been no change. So, you know, it's good that some change is happening. It's not good enough, but it's good. But I think what's really important for people to be aware of, and also to ask people, is it doesn't stop there, because it would be very easy for the government to say, you know, well, this happened, so we don't need to do any more. And they probably would say that if people don't continue to push. And I know UNGRIT will be continuing to push that drive for resentencing. And I know other people will be doing the same. And it's asking other people to continue to do that. And I know that sometimes that can be a big ask, because it's very draining and it's exhausting doing this, particularly if you've been directly affected by it. But it's important that we don't just stop there, because sometimes these things have a snowball effect. You know, it might start off small and then move on to the bigger things that we wanted.
And you can ask how you feel about these political sort of developments and how, reflecting on your experience.
I was reading some of the comments as we were speaking, and there's a few people talking about the termination. I'm just sat here. I was eligible apparently last October, November, and nothing's happened. So I don't know what's happening for me. I was told that there would be a life review. So I'm just sat patiently waiting, hoping that, you know, it would be terminated. But it's just really difficult sometimes to just live life constantly wondering, is something going to change? And to be honest, you know, I was asked, because somebody did ask in the chat about my relationship with probation. It's generally been pretty good, actually. Currently, I'm on my 8th officer. So it's also quite a high turnover. So it's really difficult to get to know one person so that, you know, they can be confident to apply for termination or resist pressing that recall button if something does go wrong. So at the moment, really, it is. I mean, we've said it a lot. I know that Mark Conway, who's doing some great stuff, he says it's like treading on eggshells, and I just feel exactly the same. But he adds he adds a bit in there. It's like treading on eggshells in a minefield, and that really does, I think, describe it quite accurately for me.
Yeah, a number of the people in the chat as well are describing it as eggshell-like. So let's go to some of the questions in the Q&A thing. There's an anonymous attendee asking when Andrew or Tommy's story is going to be made into an ITV television series. And is that the only way you can address a miscarriage of justice? It's definitely something on our radar.
There is talk of it, which is great, but these things take a long time too. So if that is to happen, it's not going to be for a few years. I'm not that it's not going to happen, but like for it to be put out there, it takes a few years. So
it's definitely something we're pursuing, I think is fair to say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just have to think about who'd play any of you in a docudrama. If menaces are refusing resentencing, do you think there's merit in advocating to be released within a defined time period? I mean, that would require resentencing is the problem given the current law. So there really isn't any way, given what's currently in statute, there's no way out except for parole board release, short of a change in law that would then be another way to deal with that cohort of people in prison is the problem, Becky. Other questions? I don't know if any of the panelists are quicker at looking at them than me.
I don't know. I saw one that just stood out to me, but it's not there. It's in the chat, and somebody mentioned something about dealing with parole. And all I would say to that, again, movie-wise, because I lived my life through movies. Shawshank Redemption, I did that film to death. I think I watched it about 20 times in prison in the 12 and a half years. And so when my first parole took place, I went there all kind of, smart. And I shared this again with the parole board the other day and was accused of trying to manipulate the parole board because I wore a shirt and a tie and stuff like that. So slowly it went to a point where I regressed and I didn't bother to wear a shirt and a tie. I turned up in, just jeans and a t-shirt or whatever. But I spent a long time reading the dossier, 100 pages, and underlining all these things that I wanted to deal with to convince them, actually, I'm not such a bad person, and this isn't true, and that's not true, and maybe that's a little bit true, but, just taking some responsibility. And then it got to a point where I just didn't turn up with the dossier at all. I'd go in and just deal with whatever was thrown at me. And there's a bit in the Shawshank Redemption, which is why I mention it, where one of the main protagonists are not Tim Robbins, but Morgan Freeman. He plays a character called Red, who every 10 years he gets knocked back. And so, there's this prison talk, what was today? And he'd say, oh, just up for another rejection. And then when he goes in with this attitude that is not blasé, but almost kind of like, I really don't care, he got parole. And so I kind of, I don't like to admit it, but I kind of leaned into that a little bit. And by the time I went to my very last parole board, I didn't have that attitude, but it certainly wasn't a million miles away from it. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question. And there's so many other bits in here that I can't keep up.
Someone's asked about APPG part in Parliament, around IPP. And to be honest, there are a core group of Lords and MPs who are really supportive of this. I mean, there could be an APPG, but I don't necessarily think it would add I don't think it would help change the current situation. Like, there's a core group of MPs and Lords that are continuing to push for this and kept up to speed by various organisations on what's happening and what we'd like them to do. And I guess many of those probably fall into the I think Charlie's on this chat, he'll know more than I do. There's an APPG around criminal justice or things like that this would fall into the category for, but there isn't one specifically for IPP.
A lot of you are putting questions into the chat. It's Henry Rossi. You should know better. It's this is very confusing. Lots of questions. So there's a question here about, do we know what Keir Starmer thinks about the IPP? You're right. He probably is going to be the Prime Minister in 6 months' time. Yeah, he knows about it and he's expressed concern about it in the past. How that translates into action, we wait and see. Channel 4 News are covering IPPs this week. I hope they are, because we've helped them place the story. So I think that is happening this week. I mean, there are a couple of questions here, as well as in the Q&A, about supports. So, Andy, maybe you could talk about what supports, if any, you've received upon release. And there's a question here as well for you, Donna, asking if you received any explanation or support. I think we know that.
Very briefly, in a nutshell, not really, no. So, I mean, most of my support, again, something I shared with the parole board a couple of weeks ago, a week ago. I happen to have been a weekend warrior a million years ago in a former life where I did some time with what was known as the Territorial Army then. So I got some support from, organisations like the Royal British Legion, Care After Combat, although I never saw any combat, and a few of those kind of charities. But I didn't really get anything from anybody else, apart from groups like HUNGRIP, who I've connected with, and Donna, and a couple of others. There was precious little. But the other thing is to kind of be fair, I came out literally 3 months before we went into lockdown. So, life was a bit chaotic, and that's not to kind of minimize the support I would have liked to have received from organizations, because I wish I had more. But at the same time, there was a bit of me, just really quickly, so I can let Donna get a word in. I resisted anything from probation, because having experienced that recall, a part of me felt like if I was open and honest about, where I was feeling, where my head was at, maybe I was going to get another one. So, there's a saying that silence can't be misquoted. So I just felt that I'd keep my mouth shut.
We hear that from a lot of people. I know there's a chap we know who got recalled for having a mental health crisis, and then he was back in for another 2 years. He wasn't even seeing his probation officer, and he went back and asked for support, and then he got recalled. So that fear is real, and it happens. In terms of the support, what Andrew is saying is what we hear all the time. And actually, because of that, a lot of the work that we do with the people that we're in contact with in prison is we try and connect them with organisations in the areas they're going to be released to, so that they've got some level of support. I mean, obviously that's quite low level because we're a very small team of volunteers doing this, but we do what we can. But that is definitely a massive gap, and it's something that should be happening by probation. But one, either isn't happening, or two, like Angie said, that there's this fear that if you're too open, you're going to get recalled, and it's a fear based on real events. So
and that fear also is earlier in the process as well, isn't it? I mean, often we hear from men who have mostly men who have at parole board stage, been asked about whether they've had problems with mental health, or whether it's suicidal ideation, or whether they've self-harm, and they're told to tell the truth, and so they tell the truth, and then that's held against them as a reason to keep them in prison, although it's the ravages of the sentence that are causing their poor mental health. So it's a really unjust cycle of damage. Henry Rossi's made a statement absolutely right about the UN statement about inhuman degrading treatment and the psychological impacts of the IPP sentence. And we know that Alice Edwards, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, has also expressed concerns about this. Henry's asked if the people could complain to the Equality and Human Rights Commission. We've been in talks with the Equality and Human Rights Commission, Henry, about this. There's very little resource, I think it's fair to say, at the Equality and Human Rights Commission. So hopefully the new government will invest in it and give it the resources to be able to provide people with real support. But I think at the moment, it would probably be not a terribly useful experience. Do we know what the Shadow Minister for Parole or Probation is saying re-sentencing, Donna?
I mean, to be honest, there is no support for resentencing on either party, which is why I think the Lords have pulled it, because they want the bill to go through. They want some change to happen before an election's called. That doesn't mean that people aren't working on them ahead of whoever gets in next year. I know I'm sure other people are doing the same. And we will be at some point doing a big drive on people contacting their own MPs around this, but also potentially new MPs who might be elected in, making sure that it's on their radar. Yeah, but yeah, in answer to that question, no, it's resentencing is not they're not agreeing to it on either side of Labour or Conservatives.
There's so many questions. I'm so sorry, people in the audience. There are too many questions. There's a question here around why we know the reasons for recall. I mean, I think it's fair to say that while recall for IPPs is huge, recall generally is huge. So we know this. So I think a fair bit of that is about probation being completely overwrought and under-resourced, and probation officers therefore choosing just to recall because they don't have the time or the bandwidth to make proper inquiries and other things. And you know, we know that probation officers get it in the neck if they get things wrong. So there's a perfect storm of lack of resource, I think, and perhaps too personal consequence for some people, might be part of the reason. Yeah, other questions? Can anyone else see them quicker than I can?
I think there's one here that's quite important. So there's one guy says, I am an IPP released for over 8 years. How can I help IPP gain release and stay out of prison once my license is terminated?
Come and help our grip.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing.
Yeah. Talk to the Howard League. We'd love to hear from you about what you think could be done. Help us communicate with people and all of that stuff. Anything done with academia? I mean, there are a number of academics already engaged.
I think the thing is there has been a lot done already. So it's kind of what else could be done that would support the cause. I think we've got a Justice Select Committee report that says resentencing is the only way to fix it. You know, using academic reports and stuff like that. I don't know. I mean, maybe there'll be a call for that more once any changes go through, because there'll be a slight shift in focus, maybe.
Simon, I'll ask our Amy or Katie to put into the chat the time frame for the Victims and Prisoners Bill, but there's no way of guessing, and it's possible there could be an early election and it will falter altogether, which would be pretty disastrous. Obviously,
sorry, I don't know. May 13th is going to be likely to be when they debate the new amendments of the laws.
But then, in terms of how long the rest of it takes, we just don't know. What other questions are there? Erosion of trust. You're absolutely right, Will. It is a massive erosion of trust. You know, it is a system that is broken. I think it speaks volumes for how poorly our criminal justice system can work. You know, when you have a position where pretty much everyone thinks it's a disaster and yet nothing can properly be done, and without, frankly, any evidence, we're told that there are still very many dangerous people. You know, where there are only, I think today's stats show 13 people who are on an IPP who haven't been still within their tariff. So these are all people who are basically, in many ways, kind of unjustly being detained. It's going to take a lot to regain trust. And we certainly have increasing numbers of people writing to us concerned about the new Labor government because they're worried that IPP was a Labor initiative and its abolition was opposed by Labor, and they're worried about what that will mean. So Labor tell us that they're going to sort it out. So hopefully that is the case. Other things you see in here, Andy, Donna? One person asked about where it came from. Yeah. What was the idea behind it? I mean, I think the idea behind, like, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was a kind of reasonably, the idea basically was that at the time that somebody's being sentenced, the sentencing judge can't entirely understand when they would be safe for release. And therefore, they should kind of put a minimum term and then allow the parole board to then at that time decide whether they're safe for release. So that's kind of the philosophy of it, is that it's impossible for the sentencing judge to really know when the person would be safe. And I think it's worth remembering as well that also, in addition to people on an IPP, we still have hundreds of people still serving 2-strike sentences, which were a pre-IPP thing. And we at the Howard League, we certainly have a lot of members amongst those people who are still in indefinitely, having got a 2-strikes pre-IPP 2-strike sentence. And I know a lot of the time they and other discretionary lifers feel sort of forgotten. So not forgotten. We have currently got some queries in with some barristers to get more information on various things with a view to challenge. So not forgotten, but it was a kind of clever approach to sentencing, for want of it.
Just going back to the question about the academic stuff, one of the things that I think is worth exploring, and I know that we've talked to some people about this already, is the narrative that's used around dangerousness and a dangerous person. And I think, research based around that and actually what that means. And I think possibly around the actual release test that was put together for people who were on determinate sentences, not indeterminate sentences. So, one, to prove that actually it's not a good tool to use anyway, especially on people on indeterminate sentences, but definitely that this idea of like a dangerous person, which, personally I feel is an absolute farce, but, having academic research to prove that doesn't exist and isn't the case, definitely would help that narrative, because that's a narrative that's now being used. It shifts around what narrative used by the MOJ to not support changes, but that's the current one that's being used. So yeah, things around that would probably be quite helpful.
Yeah. Simon's raised a question about understanding of probation and others about the IPP sentence. I think it's fair to say it's one of the reasons that HMPPS is calling this IPP week for their staff. There is, I think now, it's very late, but there seems to be some kind of commitment to increasing awareness amongst staff of the IPP sentence. So Simon, hopefully what happened to you will not happen to others, although there's obviously a lot of staff and a lot of staff turnover in that respect. Sorry, Andrew, you're going to say something.
Yeah, no, sorry. It's just I've read something there just from I think it's a probation officer who's saying something about. I feel it's fair to share that in my experience, probation officer recalls and IPP. Sorry, I'm going in a different direction.
Yeah.
I couldn't help it. IPP cases are not taken lightly, and you know what? Yeah, I mean, look, it's really hard because one of the things I've never done is bash probation. I think, probation have a really difficult job to do. Caseloads I'm hearing of recently of, in the hundreds, never mind, the low sort of tens of, 10s, 20s. But in so many of the cases that I've seen, not including mine, recall was so unnecessary. And I know that, these decisions are not necessarily taken lightly, but they're, I don't think, taken. What am I trying to say? I mean, I've seen a situation, a guy that I know recently, he was recalled for 2 years for something he didn't do. And it shouldn't take 2 years to find out that somebody's innocent of something. It really shouldn't, because this really is the stuff between life and death, because we've lost how many? I mean, it's like 90 odd people. I can't remember the exact number now.
87, I think, 86, 87.
No, it's not, 90. The MOJ don't count certain people if they've been out on leave or something. I mean, it's ridiculous, 90 people. Yeah.
And, yeah, I just think that, there is a time that we've just got to get past all of the kind of the anger, the bitterness and whatever, and just be like, look, this is no longer on the statute books, and it hasn't been there. It's been abolished for more than a decade now, just like the two strikers. And it's this time now that we get to a place where if it's safe to release somebody, release them, let them get on with their lives, let's support them and get them back to where they should have been. Because, I don't want to take it to that place, but I have to. I feel I have to. Slavery was legal for a while, and then we get to this place where it's still kind of going on. People have benefited from it. This situation has been acknowledged by at least one MP in Parliament as being likened to the post office scandal, and it took us 20 years to hear about that. Some people haven't got that time. The people that have lost loved ones don't have that time. We have to really just keep going, keep off on the gas, and do it because it's right, the right thing to do. Because there's been too much talk about. I heard in 2010 about a review that was going to take place around mini-max. They were talking about no more than this, a bit like the American model, no more than this, but no less than this. Even that would have been better than IPP, because at least you'd have an idea of when you were going home. But yeah, anyway, rant over.
Rant, very welcome, Andrew. Every right to have a rant. Can I please? We've got to the end of our hour. this mechanism of Zoom call means that nobody else who's in the audience can actually clap you to congratulate you. I'd like to thank our panel. Could everybody please clap at home? Thank you both for engaging in this conversation so honestly, and to, you know, sharing painful things but turning them into important campaigns. I mean, as Andy's just said, like, this is urgent. We don't have years to wait for things to change, and we know that there's urgency, and it's important. And I mean, happily, other people are starting to feel, I think, that urgency is being felt in other quarters. But my huge thanks to Donna and to Andrew for coming along and for the work that they continue to do. My thanks to everybody in the audience, particularly those people who've shared their personal stories of the sentence from all different sides. But I guess particularly for those of you still serving on licence, please do get in touch with us. You can certainly help and support the work of UNGRIP and the Howard League on IPPs before your licence has been terminated, just by staying quiet. We don't publicise who our supporters are in any way. So please don't hesitate to get in touch. Similarly, if you're a probation officer or a prison officer, you know, we'd love to hear from you and your experiences, because we know that people across the system, I mean, this is one thing that everybody agrees is a disgrace. It's something that the Prison Officers Association, the Prison Governors Association, all of us can agree on. Every prison governor I talk to, you know, just can't believe they're having to take care of people who should have been released years ago. So it is, you know, there's no reason that we can't all work together to get this properly dealt with. So thank you all for your ongoing work. If you're not a member of the Howard League or UNGRIP, please do sign up for both of those things. It's free. Certainly Howard League membership is free for anybody who's been to prison or the family members of people in prison. And UNGRIP membership, I'm sure, is free as well. I look forward to seeing you all back here on the 11th of June for a discussion about what the purpose of prison is. So we have Hinpal Singh Bui, whose book comes out tomorrow. It's called What's Prison For? But he is at His Majesty's Inspectorate and is an Oxford academic. And I have to say, it's, I think, one of the best books I've read about prison. So it even has pictures, which, you know, can never be a bad thing. So it's a conversation with him and with Bill Keller, who is a journalist who's also written a lot about the purpose of prisons from the US. He's a former editor of the New York Times. So I hope that you will come and join us for that conversation. Please stay in touch. The book is called What Are Prisons For? So it comes out tomorrow, I think, Becky. Please do stay in touch. And thanks once again to Andrew and Donna for coming along and sharing today. Thank you, everyone. Bye.